Well, good afternoon, friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests. My name is Melissa Kennedy, and I'm the Executive Vice President at Sun Life. I'm also proud to be a member of the Board of Directors of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I would like to welcome all of you to today's conversation, a very special one between His Excellency Cong Peiwu, Ambassador of the People's Republic of China to Canada, and Stewart Beck, President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation. I'm particularly pleased to welcome His Excellency because in pre-COVID days, I traveled extensively to China as part of my Sun Life duties. And with COVID, I really miss seeing my friends and business colleagues in Beijing. First, let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Although you are joining us in this virtual space today from many places all across Canada, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. The City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're grateful to Canada's Indigenous peoples for the stewardship of these lands where we work, live, and play, and we collectively are committed to the process of reconciliation. I would like to sincerely thank His Excellency, the Ambassador, for agreeing to share his thoughts with us today and to continue this very important dialogue with Canadians. We really value opportunities like these. Today's conversation is an important and timely one. China is one of the world's largest economies, and it's soon to become the largest. China is and will be even more important to Canada culturally and economically. Canada, in turn, is an important source of resources and commodities and talent for China. From our vantage point at Sun Life, our operations in China and Asia more broadly, of course, are very important to us. We have operations in 8 different countries across the region, and in China, we're part of a joint venture with Everbright Bank, which is based in Beijing. We've also had a business serving the Hong Kong market for over 100 years. At this time, the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, as well as the extradition case against Madam Meng Wanzhou, has strained our bilateral relations. APF Canada's recent national opinion poll, in fact, has tracked an unfortunate decline in sentiment towards China amongst Canadians since those events. It is in this context, therefore, that dialogue is crucial for understanding the challenges that face our two nations. I hope this conversation is an opportunity to have a common understanding of Canada and China and how we can find shared interests in navigating the global economy, particularly as we head into a post-pandemic world. Finally, I'd also like to thank the Asia Pacific Foundation for hosting this important discussion. Since its creation in 1984, our not-for-profit foundation has played an invaluable role in building ties and connections between Canadians and the people of China and Asia more broadly at many different levels and in many different ways. We look forward to this discussion between the Ambassador and Stewart Beck. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Stewart.
Thank you very much, Melissa. A very, very nice opening for, I think, a very important conversation. And again, I'd just like to reiterate the role of the foundation is in our legislation. It's about engagement with Asia and the Asia region, and China being a very important part of that process. And specifically, the foundation is about promoting dialogue and understanding of foreign policy issues as they relate to Canada and the region. So again, Ambassador, this is a very timely dialogue and conversation. And I'd just like to introduce the Ambassador, somebody who I think everybody who was invited to the session has this curriculum vitae, but I'd just like to mention a couple of things in the CV. The Ambassador is not, this is not a new posting or a different situation for him. He was here back in the early 2000s, actually, as we were talking prior to the event. He was in Canada at the time I was in Shanghai. So it's you know, this is a familiar country to him. And prior to coming to Canada on his posting last year, he was a Director General for North American Oceania Affairs. Again, somewhat similar because when I returned from Shanghai, I was the Director General for North Asia and Oceania Affairs. So we've had similar trajectories in our diplomatic careers. So Ambassador, welcome. We're happy to have you here. I have a few questions, and maybe if it makes some sense, would you like to say a few opening remarks before we start? And then I'll get into the questions that are some that I've drafted, but we've also had some questions that come in from people outside. And then once we've had a conversation, I'm going to ask Jeff Reeves, our Vice President of Research, just to moderate a conversation between the two of us. So Ambassador, would you like to say a few words before we start?
Yes, yeah. First, I would like to thank you, Ms. Kennedy and Mr. Beck, for your kind introduction. Also, I would like to express my appreciation for the foundation for organizing this event. I think that's an important opportunity for us to be engaged in a constructive conversation on issues, which has a bearing on our bilateral relationship and even beyond. I always value this kind of dialogues, that gives us the opportunity to talk about a lot of important issues, currently confronting us. So thank you once again for you and your colleagues for hosting this event.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. And I'll just jump in with the first question because we only have an hour. And I know there will be some people who'd like to ask some questions as part of this process. And I would ask you to use the chat box and the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask some questions. Canada is obviously watching what's going on, Ambassador, with Australia. From our perspective, it seems that China is using economic measures to express its displeasure with the Morrison's administration's vocal criticism of Chinese foreign and domestic affairs. China's involvement in Australia's foreign and domestic affairs. And it reminds us to a degree of our early days with the situation with Meng Wanzhou, when China was using, again, tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers to exert their unhappiness besides the detention of the two Michaels. Is this now becoming a part of Chinese foreign policy to use your economic strength as part of dealing with countries such as Australia and perhaps Canada?
Well, I think for us, China always attaches great importance to economic and trade relationship with other countries. But what we pursue is a relationship based on win-win cooperation and mutual benefit, because we believe this kind of cooperation is mutually benefit in nature. And for us, currently, we are focusing on the new economic development stage and new development philosophy with the ongoing efforts to formulate a new development pattern. That is to say, with the domestic circulation as the mainstay and the domestic and international circulations reinforcing each other. So it's not a closed loop, but rather it means China will be opening up to the outside at a higher level and in more broader areas. So for us, there's nothing like we are using this kind of economic and the trade cooperation as a weapon, to punish other countries. As you mentioned, for the Australian case, I think the situation is that our practices, by the relevant Chinese authorities for those Australian exports are in line with our laws and the regulations and international customary practices. And the purpose is to ensure the safety of our consumers and the legitimate rights and the interests of relevant industries in China. And also that is in accordance with the free trade agreement between China and Australia. And if you talk about anything like this kind of frictions, in terms of economy and trade, I would like to share with you some of the figures. And according to what we have is that for Australian side, it has mounted more than 106 investigations against China in terms of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy. Well, on the Chinese side, there are only 4 cases of the same kind. So you can see, who is doing this kind of sanctions, or at least this kind of threatening words. As for Canada, it's almost the same situation. Last year, indeed, there had been suspension, for a while of the Canadian meat products, the export that to China, because back in June last year, we had found out a large number of health certificates related to those meat exports, are actually of serious problems. And later on, the Canadian side also recognized that there's a large number of forged documents on the Canadian side. So we had to suspend this kind of imports from Canada for a while. Later on, the Canadian side had put forward some measures to correct the mistakes. And after the examination of that, our experts determined that it basically meet our safety requirements. So after that, we have resumed those meat imports from Canada. And for the first 10 months of this year, you can see a very robust performance on the part of the Canadian export in terms of pork. According to the figure I got for the first 10 months, it's like more than 227% increase year on year. So that's huge. And China now it's the #1 market for export of Canada's pork. And for the canola seeds, also the same situation, because here what we are doing is to make sure that we safeguard the consumers' interests, the safety of our industries. And also back to the March last year, after repeated discovery of the quarantine pests in those exports from Canada, we had to suspend those companies involved. There have been 2 of them actually, but still, it's an ongoing process for the 2 sides. The technical experts are talking about the specific issues. So hopefully they can reach a conclusion in the not too far future. I would like to suggest that actually, even against the backdrop of COVID-19, the export of Canada to China has increased by 6.6% for the first 10 months of this year. And that's also taking place while your total export to the global markets has dropped by more than 14%. So you could see, the resilience of the economic and trade cooperation between our 2 countries. And there's no such thing that China is using this kind of economic and trade ties as a weapon to punish other countries. And if there's any country, it's the United States. As you can clearly see, the United States has been engaging in this kind of activities more and more in recent years. China is a victim of that, and for Canada and a lot of other countries also victims of that kind of unilateral sanction or long-arm jurisdiction of the United States. So we hope the United States, will stop this kind of activities, and we also hope that Canada, the people here, will have a correct understanding of our practice. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. And I think your numbers are quite compelling. And we'll come back, I think, a little later on a question on the United States. But I think what you're seeing in the press, in particular, we have just recently released the results of our national opinion poll, and given the current circumstances in our bilateral relationship, the differing value and political systems in between our 2 countries, it's not a surprise to see that Canadian attitudes towards China have hardened and dropped considerably. And do you see this as a concern that, and are you sharing these results with Beijing? Because Canada, is a middle power, but it's an influential middle power, and we have a democratically elected government. And our approach to China will be impacted by the prevailing public opinion. And quite frankly, Ambassador, I was quite shocked to see the drop from 2018 to 2020 in terms of Canadians perceiving China as an opportunity as opposed to a threat. So at 2018, 66% of the Canadian respondents saw China as an opportunity, and only 33% in 2020. So it's a major drop, and I'm just be curious to know if this is being told to Beijing, and what's your response to that?
For diplomats, we always relay, the relevant messages, back home. And for public opinion, I do have taken note of your recent survey, the result of that. And I think there are many factors when it comes to the public opinion. And I think in the recent years, one of the important factors, it's about the media, in Western countries. And for those medias, many of them, when they are reporting China, they tend to have to do this kind of reporting in a selective way or even a distorted way. They don't report, those true stories, but rather they have been engaged in those kind of spreading of misinformation or disinformation. And plus, some politicians in the Western countries, out of their own political self-interest and their political agenda, are also being engaged in this kind of activities. So you can see, since the early of this year, those from the United States, they have been doing this kind of smearing campaign against China, especially when it comes to the fighting against COVID-19, because they have been mishandling the situation back in the United States. So they would like to shift the blame to China. So they are spreading this kind of political virus. And unfortunately, this kind of remarks and actions also have, impact here in Canada. So it's a misleading, for the Canadian general public. Of course, I think the most important factor contributing to the results of the survey here, from your side, is of the two Canadian citizens who had been detained in China, and all the reports here suggesting there had been arbitrary detention and coercive diplomacy. But that's not the case at all. I would like to once again, elaborate on our position that these two Canadian citizens, they have been detained and prosecuted by the judicial organs of China because they have been in the suspected crimes endangering our national security in China. So our relevant authorities are handling the cases according to law and in an independent way. And at the same time, their lawful rights have been guaranteed. So there's no such thing as these two persons, there's been mistreatment for them. The reports, some of them suggesting that their reading glasses have been taken away. There's nothing like that. Actually, in fact, they have been provided with adequate food and services in terms of, in this period of COVID-19, even the better food to make sure that their immune system have been enhanced so they can better deter the risk of being infected. And also, I think when you look at the relationship, you cannot avoid the question of Mengmenzhou incident. And that's the main obstacle in our bilateral relationship. And for this particular incident, exploited by the United States. And the main purpose for that is trying to suppress Huawei and other high-tech industries of China. And for Canada, it's being involved because it's misusing or it's abusing its bilateral extradition treaty with the United States. And in this regard, it's playing the role of accomplice of the United States. So we are asking Canada actually to take into account the serious nature of the issue of concern. And in fact, a lot more people here, they have come in to see through the nature of the case of Madame Meng, and they are asking for the Canadian side to make the right decision. So we believe that their voices are worth pondering. So we hope and we urge the Canadian government to make the right decision as soon as possible to release Madame Meng and to ensure her safe return back to China, to make sure that favorable conditions are created for the bilateral relationship to be back on track. And for the public opinion, I also want to add that actually you have to take into consideration those surveys, released by the your institute or any other, polling companies. But at the same time, people have also to take into account of the current political atmosphere here in Canada, because from what I have observed, each time I talk to the people here, I have had extensive contacts with people. Before COVID-19 broke out, I visited a number of cities, and after that, I kept in touch, with all those important persons, from East Coast to West Coast, through telephone conversations and video links. And I think a lot of people are still, valuing this relationship between China and Canada, and they perceive China as an opportunity rather as a threat to Canada. But because of this political atmosphere, they are afraid of speaking out their minds in support of the relationship. So that's a worrying sign. And I think actually a lot of people still here, they cherish the relationship as we do. We cherish this relationship, and from the past 5 decades since we have established diplomatic relations, we believe one of the most important experience is that a healthy and sound relationship serves the common interest of our two peoples. So still, we value this relationship, and we believe that we can do a lot of things together, whether it's a multilateral front or a bilateral trade and investment. But I do hope that the Canadian side will make right decision and to resolve properly our outstanding issue and to make sure that relationship is back on track first. Thank you.
Well, and Ambassador, I appreciate what you're saying, but as a former member of Global Affairs Canada, Michael Kovrig in particular is a former colleague. So, I mean, this is something that's quite close to my concern, and I'm concerned of many Canadians. And it's something that, in the context of the two Michaels and Madame Wang Hongzhou, it's not quite the same in terms of the two Michaels being in prison, and Madame Wang is is out on bail right now. So it's not quite the equivalent situation, and it's something I think that will always be of concern to Canadians, because it is front and center in the media, and we just passed the second anniversary of them being held in detention. So I think it's something that we have to be aware is always going to have an impact on public opinion. Just another thought, Ambassador. Last week, the Foreign Vice Minister Le Yuchang spoke to an audience at Renmin University about the idea of wolf warrior diplomacy. And he rejected the label, saying instead that China now felt it necessary to defend itself more forcefully from international criticism. Some Chinese scholars, like Renmin's own Shi Yinghong, have advised against wolf warrior diplomacy, arguing too much assertiveness could lead to Chinese isolation. After almost a year in Canada, Ambassador, I'd be interested to know from your own experience here, what you consider to be the best approach for China to achieve its diplomatic goals.
Before I make comments on this question, first I would like to just add a few words on the previous one, because someone tend to link the cases of the two Canadian citizens with that of Madame Meng, but they are totally different in nature. For Madame Meng, she's innocent and she has broken no Canadian laws at all, but still she has been detained in Vancouver for more than 2 years. So that's why Chinese people are angry about that, and they would like to see the Canadian side to take right step forward immediately. Back to your question about the so-called wolf warrior. I think this kind of suggestion is just a new version of China threat theory, because if you look at China's history and Chinese culture, for us, the key words is peace and harmony. If you look at the 5,000-year-old Chinese history, you would like to see that For us, we are always honoring those two key words. It's like kind in our DNA. And for us, currently, we are committed to a path of peaceful development. It's enshrined in our constitution. So we are the one to make contributions to the world peace and development. And we are the number 2 contributor to the UN regular budget. And the largest one, in terms of the P5 in sending UN peacekeepers around the world. And we have joined, almost all the universal intergovernmental organizations, and we have signed more than 500 international and multilateral treaties. So for us, the question here is not we are closing our doors to the outside, or we are imposing our ideas on the outside. But what we are doing is to make necessary steps, to take necessary steps to defend our legitimate rights, our national security, our sovereignty and territorial integrity. Because as you can see that over the years, led by the United States, some countries have been engaged in this kind of campaign against China, trying to blacken our image, trying to interfere in China's internal affairs, trying to sabotage the normal exchange between China and other countries. So it's very dangerous. And for us, we have to take steps forward to make sure that our interests, our rights are going to be preserved. So we are not the one to initiate the trouble, but we are also, we will not flinch if the trouble comes their own way. For the Chinese people, we are of principle and we have our backbone. And for us, we will certainly, come forward to defend our national security and interests. And at the meantime, as the largest developing country in the world, also what we are doing is also to safeguard the interests and the legitimate rights of those developing countries. So for us, we are not the one who are engaged in those campaigns of smearing, but rather for those people, especially in the United States, Secretary Pompeo and his line, day in and day out, they have been waging this kind of abuses and attacks against China. And what they are doing are just have no diplomatic etiquette at all. It's just against all those diplomatic etiquette. So we have to come forward. So the suggestion that China is like using the wolf warrior is trying to prevent China from speaking out the truth and to defend its national interests. And for isolation, I don't think China is isolated. If you look at all those circumstances, like in the venue of Human Rights Council, you could see that each time when this kind of meetings is convened, those countries, the number of that speaking in favor of our policies are far outnumbered those who are against China. And when it comes to the international cooperation, you can see that for China, we have signed documents of cooperation with 138 countries and more than a dozen international organizations in terms of Belt and Road Initiative. So there's nothing like China being isolated. So that's my comment on this particular question. Thank you.
Well, Ambassador, again, it's the fact that you're having this conversation with us, this dialogue, I think is a sign that this type of this way of managing and conversations, I think, can be quite productive, because we understand your position. I think you have a good sense of where we are from a Canadian perspective. So I think it's really, again, fundamentally about dialogue, about conversation, about where we can find a common ground on certain key and important issues, such as the situation between the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou, some of these other issues that we may not agree on, but at least we can have a conversation about it. And you and I actually had a conversation a couple of weeks ago when you asked me what I thought the impact of a new administration in the United States would be on Canada's position with, towards China. And what I'd like to do is maybe turn that question to you now in this conversation and say, so Ambassador, now we do know we have a Biden administration that's coming in. Their approach may be more in terms of bringing their allies together in a way to deal with China. Does that give you concern? Does that give China concern with a new administration coming in terms of how that alliance structure might work and what that might mean for China's ability to cope with that type of arrangement?
Mr. Beck, also I value this kind of constructive dialogue very much. I think that's very useful. And for the China-US relations, I think it's now at a historical critical juncture. And I think for us, for the new administration, the message is very clear that we would like to see a healthy and stable relationship between China and the United States, because it not only serves the fundamental interests of our two sides, but also it will meet the common expectation from the international community. And for us, we hope and we would like to pursue the relationship in the spirit of non-conflict, non-confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation, and to work with the United States to focus on cooperation and to manage differences and to push forward this sound and stable relationship, and joining hands with the international community and other countries for the noble cause of world peace and development. So that's our message. And I think currently what we should do is to make sure that we have a smooth transition. And after that, we resume dialogues. We put the relationship back onto right track. And we will rebuild the mutual trust, between the two sides. That's very important. And I think for someone suggesting that the US forming an alliance, in the world to be against China, that's based on the Cold War mentality. And it's for zero-sum game. It's not in our interest to do that. We firmly oppose that. And I believe the people around the world will also be opposed to this kind of idea. Because for us, I think the new Cold War is very dangerous, especially at this time. Our purpose, our aim should be focused on the fighting against COVID-19 to make sure that we recover the world economy and we cope with climate change. And for climate change, it's a very important issue. It has a lot of bearing upon humankind. Either for China, United States, or Canada, we have a lot of diverging interests in this regard. And more recently, our side has put forward some further commitment for 2030 goal when it comes to the climate change. President Xi mentioned just a few days ago that actually we will reduce our CO2 emission per unit of GDP by more than 65% compared to the level of 2005. And we will also increase our non-fossil energy, in the primary energy consumption to 25% by 2030. And we will also increase our forest stock volume to 6 billion cubic meters. That also compared to the 2005 level. And we will make sure that we have the installed capacity for solar energy, wind energy, totaling 1.2 billion kilowatts. So it demonstrates our ambition in this regard. And I do think China, United States, Canada, and all the other international communities, we can focus on this kind of cooperation. So I don't think this kind of alliance, to be particularly against China will work. And also for Canada, I think because you are a close ally of the United States, you manage your own affairs. But I do hope because for Canada being a country renowned for its independence in foreign policy, and which is demonstrated in your attitude towards Iraq war and your relationship with Cuba, you can continue to display the wisdom and the courage and to remove the third party interference from the United States. By doing so, you can not only manage well your relationship with the United States, but you can also move ahead with all those practical cooperation with China. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I think most of us Canadians would agree with you that we do like to take our own sovereign approach to issues that are global in nature, but we do have an alliance structure that's important to us and has been historically important. But there's another, I think, important issue for Canada. In 2011, the foundation did a survey of how many Canadians there are in Hong Kong, and that survey said that there's 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is an important issue for Canada. So with the imposition of a national security law, many outsiders are concerned that Beijing is no longer interested in letting Hong Kong operate as a special administrative region with respect to governance and the rule of law. How should we understand Beijing's plans towards Hong Kong? And how can Canada work with China to ensure the best outcomes for Hong Kong?
Hong Kong affairs are purely China's domestic affairs, and we don't want to see any other country to be interfering in the Hong Kong related affairs or China's domestic affairs. At the same time, however, we would like to see that all the countries could come to understand that maintaining Hong Kong's stability and prosperity not only serves the interests of China, but also that is in line with the interests of other countries, including Canada. For the argument that China is not interested in the rule of law in Hong Kong, I don't think that argument holds water. Because if you look back last year's situation, what happened since June last year was really the lack of rule of law in Hong Kong. Those criminal activities like arson, like looting, like smashing, or even attacking innocent civilians and the policemen, it's bringing very disastrous effect on the stability and the prosperity on Hong Kong. And it scared away a lot of foreign investors as well. So for that, the central government has to take resolute steps to make sure that we plug the loopholes in Hong Kong security area. So that's why the law of the safeguarding national security in Hong Kong has been adopted and implemented. And it is to ensure a more steady and sustained implementation of one country, two systems. And it's designed to make sure that the social stability can be maintained. And we have seen the effect of that. So according to the latest survey in Hong Kong, more than 80% of those surveyed believe their daily lives are not affected by the implementation of this new law. And around 70% of that believes that the implementation of the law actually is conducive in making sure Hong Kong is becoming more stable and safer. And I think that's good news, not only for those residents in Hong Kong, but also for those large number of foreigners, including those you mentioned, 300,000 Canadian passport holders in Hong Kong, whether they are living there or doing business there in Hong Kong. And for our plan for Hong Kong to develop, I think that's very clear. It's also, in our 14th five-year plan and the long-range objective through the year of 2035, which has just been adopted during our very important plenary session for the CPC in late October. And we emphasize that we have to continue to implement one country, two systems in full and comprehensive and accurate terms, and to make sure that the integration among the mainland, Hong Kong and Macau will be better implemented. So I think now the strategy is for us to see a grand strategy for the Hong Kong, Macau, and the Guangdong province, the greater Bay Area. That's our national strategy, and that's very important. So for the next 5 years and even beyond, we'll see more that putting into practice. And with that, I can see that Hong Kong taking the best advantage of the implementation of one country, two systems. It will have more and more cooperation with the mainland in terms of economy, in terms of Medicare, in terms of employment, a lot more opportunities for the Hong Kong residents, especially those young people. So I think the prospect for Hong Kong is promising. Advance to Canada, how can you play a role? I think, I do hope that your side will have a objective understanding of this national security law in Hong Kong, and to support our efforts to make sure that we maintain the social order and the rule of law in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Well, Ambassador, I'm just looking at the time, and I have one question that I'd like to ask you, one more, and then I think Jeff will come in, and he's been curating some of the questions that have come in from the audience, so we'll have another question and answer period. So I'm not too sure if you can spare a few more minutes after 1 o'clock, well, after 2 o'clock our time, just to answer a few of these questions, because I think there's some good ones in the Q&A box. But there's one that we just produced a paper. Jeff, as a matter of fact, was the author of a paper on the Indo-Pacific. I'm sure you are aware that countries such as Australia, Japan, India, and the United States have been pushing for the Indo-Pacific as a geographic and strategic component, a counterpoint to what's considered the Asia-Pacific. And we're called the Asia-Pacific Foundation, so this has some bearing on how we see ourselves. So ASEAN and some European countries have also voiced support for an Indo-Pacific outlook, although one that is what we would say more inclusive and more diverse than the quote-unquote free and open Indo-Pacific, which is really the Japanese, US, Australian, and Indian construct. So what are your thoughts on the Indo-Pacific? Because we don't often hear from China on their views on that. And do you have a recommendation, again, how we should be looking at it? Because we obviously are quite interested as a country that strategically the importance of India, but we're not as invested in the Indian Ocean like some of the other countries that we're talking about. So how do you see this, and how would you explain this to Canada from the Beijing's perspective?
Basically, I believe this term is also reminds us of a Cold War era. We believe, in essence, this kind of a product is a product, still of a Cold War mentality. It's like using a small block to actually to be against the overall architecture of the Asia Pacific, because it likes that this kind of concept is designed to stoke, the confrontation, among the nations in the region. And also, I think that for us, we would like to see those basic principles of cooperation and coordination in the Asia Pacific being preserved. So Indo-Pacific, this kind of term, I hardly believe it's popular among the region. Actually, during the APEC summit last month, I think a lot of the countries and the economies in the region, they have reacted very positively to the idea by the Chinese side, which we put forward to suggest that we should join hands in building a Asia-Pacific community with a shared future. That's important, and that's also taking into account the concerns of those, East Asian countries plus ASEAN countries, which also formulate a very important part of the Asia-Pacific region. And also you can notice the recently concluded negotiation on the part of RCEP. That's promising because that holds the most, populous, free trade agreement with the 2.2 billion people, in that part of the region for ASEP, and almost 30% of GDP involved for the global as a total. So that's a very promising prospect for the Asia-Pacific cooperation. So we do encourage this kind of cooperation, and we are against this kind of block, small block one, like Indo-Pacific, and that's dangerous, and that's against the trend of the times. And I think for Canada, you are the important member of the Asia-Pacific community because we are the founding member of APEC. And we do believe that peaceful and prosperous Asia-Pacific is also in the interest of Canada. And however, from the survey released by your side, there's fewer people currently believe Canada is part of the Asia-Pacific community. Maybe I would like to ask you to comment on that, but it's also a kind of a trend I have noted. 5 percentage points, is a drop, right? Like that compared to 2018. But still, I believe Canada can play, and we hope you will play a constructive and positive role in the Asia-Pacific region. And for that, I think we value your contribution to the stability and the prosperity in the region. If you can look at that from your own interest and to put that into practice, into your diplomacy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for having read the survey that closely, because in fact that was one of the concerning things for me when in fact the Canadians seeing themselves as part of the Asia Pacific region has been going up until this last poll that we had, where it dropped, as you said, by 5 percentage points. And one of the reasons I put to that, and that when the foundation was set up back in the mid 80s, Japan was taking a very big profile in North America with investments and the automotive industry and the such like. And really the foundation, I think, was set up to understand, Asia better because of Japan's, emergence within the global context. And what happens, I think, today is that China has become a focal point. And because of the relationship that we have right now, currently the last couple of years with China, I think that has an impact to a degree on how people see Asia as a whole, because unfortunately, we don't necessarily understand that Asia's a big place with many different countries, with many different societies. You have, of course, China commanding a lot of attention. You have India, which is becoming emerging, and then of course ASEAN is becoming important. So, as long as people understand that the region is more than just one country, then I think we would see some difference. Lots of other questions, Ambassador. We scratched the surface. I'd love to talk to you about RCEP. I mean, I have a whole a view of on the technology issues that are beginning to emerge. But I think what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Jeff. And Jeff, if you'd like to come up on the screen and ask some questions, I think mostly probably for the ambassador, but I'm happy to jump in if there's some things that would make sense as well. So you've been looking at the questions. There's a few there that I've seen on the Q&A box. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Stewart, and thank you, Ambassador Cong, for your comments. I think many of the questions that we received in the question and answer box had to do with continued discussion of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, as well as Meng Wanzhou, and some of the challenges that these ongoing situations pose to Canada and China finding opportunity for deeper engagement on other issues. For example, pandemic-related cooperation, climate change, dealing with opioids, for example, anti-corruption efforts, those types of issues that are so essential to the bilateral relationship. So I'd like to ask the question of both the ambassador and yourself, Stewart. Is it possible for Canada and China to move forward with cooperation on a bilateral relationship outside of the Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels situation, or is the relationship fundamentally stalled until we can find an opportunity to address the detention of the two Michaels in China and the ongoing investigation into Meng Wanzhou here in Vancouver?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Reeves. I think for our two sides, the relationship, the day-to-day operation of that is still in the process. So I mentioned, the trade ties between our two sides, right? At the outset of our conversation. So you could see that your export to China increased by 6.6% for the first 10 months of this year. And also for our exchange in terms of people-to-people exchange is still ongoing process. Of course, due to COVID-19, the people traveling across Pacific, it's a huge decrease. But for the students, coming here to Canada, still there's a large number of that. It's more than 200,000 Chinese students are enrolled in the universities and the colleges here in Canada. Of course, some of them are taking online courses back in China. And each time I talk to the presidents here, with the universities here in Canada, they would like to see more and more Chinese students coming this way. Of course, I would like to welcome increasing number of Canadian students to visit China, to study in China, because I believe that's a way for Canadian people to get a better understanding of China. Each time I talk to someone who has been to China in the past, I believe he or she more or less has a more objective reading of what's happening in China and has a rational attitude towards China-Canada relationship. So I do encourage this two-way movement between the peoples. And also, I think in terms of environmental protection, climate change, things like that, we also have this day-to-day exchange and the cooperation. Of course, in terms of fighting virus, that's also becoming increasingly important for our two countries. And we have been engaged in a number of research projects, on two sides. Here you have your National Health Institute, and it's rolling out a lot of projects, and China has taken part in some of them. And the two sides, the health experts, also exchange views on how to deal with the virus through video links. So it's an ongoing process. But still, I would like to suggest that there is great potential for us to tap into for our cooperation in future time. And for that, I really believe that we can remove the main obstacle, that is Meng Wanzhou's incident, for the relationship to be back on the right track. And as such, we can have more opportunities to actually to move ahead with our cooperation and the coordination, whether it's bilateral or multilateral. So that's my message. Thank you.
And if I can just add a couple of words to that, Jeff, I think, it's going to be very difficult at the political level, government to government level, for things to move forward, because this is really a defining issue between the two countries right now. But as the ambassador says, I think when it comes to trade and to the commercial level, and also at the scientific level to a degree, when you talk about areas such as the pandemic and global health, and we talk about environmental protection and climate change, these are issues that we have a common understanding and a common interest to build. And quite frankly, we've talked about how the supply chain network in particular is going to be changing. Some of it will be repatriated, some of it will go to other countries, but the reality is it's not going to happen overnight. And if you take a look at at where China is economically right now, and its growth, it's almost back to, if I'm not mistaken, it's over pre-COVID growth rates right now. So it's going to be natural. There still will be companies that need the supply chain network and it's in our interest to maintain that. While if we do diversify how we do that, but also there are the opportunities that China provide, from a business perspective because of what's going on. So we have to really think about this quite carefully in terms of how we manage that going forward. And I think, I think the ambassadors hit on a couple of really important issues, such as global health cooperation and areas around climate change in particular, which are really important to both China and to Canada.
I think we have time just for one more quick question for Ambassador Cong. I wonder, you talked about Asia Pacific community and some of the discussions that happened around APEC. How does China view developments in the Asia Pacific going forward in a post-COVID world? And how can Canada and China find opportunities to engage within the Asia Pacific region around some of the post-pandemic issues with respect to institutions and trade and public health in a way that you think would benefit the two states' bilateral relationship? And if I could also just quickly add on the end of that, now that China seems to have demonstrated an effective vaccine, will China be providing that vaccine to Asia Pacific states as a matter of foreign policy priority?
For vaccine, we have made it clear on many occasions that we will be make sure that it's going to be an international public product after the vaccine research is finished and it's deployed, and especially we will make sure that developing countries will be a top priority in this regard. Just as Canada, you have done, I think recently you have committed more than 400 million Canadian dollars into helping the developing countries in getting a vaccine. So in that regard, also we have a lot of common languages in making sure those less developed countries will get the vaccine in place to better deter the virus. And also when it comes to the future development of Asia Pacific region after COVID-19, I think there's a lot we can do together. Of course, first, the economic recovery, that's the top priority, because in the past, Asia Pacific region has been serving as a powerhouse, the most important powerhouse for the world economy. And I think with the joint efforts between China, Canada, and other members of the Asia Pacific community, we can continue to achieve that goal, to make sure that Asia Pacific will come back in an even strong shape, to contribute to the growth of world economy. And secondly, I think in terms of the infrastructure building, that's also very important. Connectivity in the region, and that's what we are focusing our energy on. That is also related to the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of railways, a lot of ports, a lot of roads have been built, and we would like to see more of that in future time. And also, I think a very important area also is to address the environmental protection, because people have come to realize that we cannot just develop ourselves at the cost of damaging the environment. So I think in this regard, China and the countries in the region, we can do a lot of things together. And of course, there's a lot like people-to-people exchange, cultural events. So I think in this regard, and in a lot more areas, China and Canada and the regional countries, we can share our ideas and to come forward with more promising proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, ambassadors. I believe we've run up at the end of the time for our presentation today. Stewart, I'll hand the floor back over to you, and we can proceed as you desire.
Yes, I'd just like to thank you very much, Ambassador, for taking the time to have this conversation with us. I think a couple of things have come out of this for me. We will have areas that we will disagree. I mean, that's the nature of the role of diplomats, to find solutions to a problem. The unfortunate situation here is the problem has gone on for quite a while, which makes it difficult for us to move forward on a government-to-government level. But my hope is through conversations like this, we'll find some sort of common ground that will allow us to move forward and to make some of the very positive comments that you made about where we have opportunities for collaboration, how we can move forward in areas that I think are fundamentally important for Canadian strategic and national interests. So I think, and also for Chinese interests. So that's something that I think has come out of this conversation. The other thing I'd like to I think, reinforce what you said, and that's the role of the Asia Pacific region for the future of the global economy. And one of the things that we talk often about at the foundation, Ambassador, is the importance of the region for in terms of its size and growth, the size of its GDP, global GDP, and also in terms of global consumer consumption. So these are all important issues that we need to consider in how we build a strategy from a Canadian government perspective. We didn't talk about other issues which are somewhat contentious. Obviously, we didn't talk about Xinjiang human rights. We didn't talk about, as I mentioned, the technology issues. We should have had a conversation about RCEP, because I think that's something else that indicates the role that China plays within the region itself. So these are all things that hopefully we can have another conversation if you're willing to discuss these types of issues, because they're all important, I think, for us going forward. But on the whole, Ambassador, the fact that you were willing to dedicate this time to a conversation like this was most welcome on our perspective, and I hope the people who've been listening have enjoyed listening to your perspective on things. So, Ambassador, thank you. Thank your team for helping organize, and I'd like to thank the staff at the Asia Pacific Foundation for putting the logistics together. So, Ambassador, I hope we have a chance to talk in the not too distant future, and thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, and I would like to say that we really agree to disagree, and at the same time, we should identify new areas for cooperation while we are preserving the traditional ones for cooperation. So there's a lot of things we can do together, and we appreciate this opportunity to talk to you, and I'm happy to engage in more constructive dialogues with the foundation. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Ambassador.